We've had sort of 50 years of feminism that's made a lot of progress and hopefully will continue to make progress. Men are now kind of undergoing that journey themselves. So my dad died quite suddenly when I was 13, and I lost the only elder male role model I had in my life. My identity was formed around mostly white British kids. So it created this sort of conflict and this divide, this sort of dual
Yeah.
identity.
What are those traditional notion of being a man that you had to challenge?
Intimacy, being intimate with everyone, and especially men, and being able to cultivate intimacy in my male friendships. Confusion, isolation, figuring this out on your own. That kind of transition from boy to man. I've got to carry this weight, this load. I must be the breadwinner in the family. 3 out of all 4 suicides in the UK are men. That's been the case for a couple of decades now. It's the same in Germany, it's the same in the US. In fact, men are 3 times more likely to abuse alcohol or drugs. What is the role of man? What is masculinity? Men want to change, but also should change, but also then change to what?
What is that worst piece of advice that you received as a child that you would not want to give to anyone, and especially as a boy child?
Don't talk about your feelings.
Thank you so much, Jindy. Such a pleasure having you here.
Thanks for having me on. Really looking forward to this conversation.
Pleasure. Let me just begin from this question. You call yourself Jindy. And during our conversation, you mentioned that the name is Rajinder. So help me understand, when did Rajinder become Jindy? What was that episode of your life?
Yeah, I was born in the UK, grew up in the UK, and so most of my friends growing up were British, I'm British Indian, they were just British. And they gave me the name. They shortened Rajinder to Jindy, and it stuck. But I think also as I got older, I liked it. I liked it because it was different. And there were many other Rajinders in the community. So it's quite a common name. It's a bit like Richard as an English name. And I liked Jindy, just felt a bit different. So it stuck. There was no reason to change it.
Yeah. These are the small episodes in your life that stay with you. I remember when I started traveling internationally, people started calling me with different names. Somebody would call me Gaurav, somebody would call me Gaurav, somebody would call me with some or the other name. Now, interestingly, there came a time when I still remember I was in Colorado, if my memory supports me. I was in one of those conferences and I was speaking. And this one lady said, "Your name sounds very complicated. What should we be calling you?" And interestingly, there I was talking about why it's so important to be an ease to work with others, how you need to take yourself lightly. And when this lady asked me this question, I thought for a while. I said, what is it that I could do that will allow me to have that lightness in my name as well? And I looked at my name, Gaurav. I said, let me just drop all the vowels, all the A's, all the U's I dropped. And what remained was GRV. So in my friend circles, especially people who don't stay in India, they call me GRV. And it stayed with me.
Yeah, and it kind of invites the question, what is a name? A name is given to us. What does it mean to us? What's our attachment to it? It represents all sorts of things. In my case, it represents my heritage. The name has a meaning in Punjabi. So there's all those sorts of associations, which as a child, I wasn't really aware of. It was just, Jindy sounds cool. Friends want to call me Jindy. I like that. I like the sound of it. It feels different.
Yeah. I can so much relate to it. And especially when you said that we got attached to them. There's an identity attached to the name as well. And a part of our life, we spend or we invest, or let me take one step forward, we waste in protecting that identity. And if you look at small children, one of those easier identities that they start to associate themselves with is the identity of name, the identity of being a girl or a boy very early in their lives, being the country that you're born into. So I'm so looking forward to explore all these conversations with you. An Indian who settled in Britain, Rajinder became Jindy. The identity of being a male, you started questioning that. There's so much that I can't wait to explore. Thank you for this opportunity, Jindy.
I'm looking forward to this exploration. I think identity is a great way into this because there is so much to what you've just described. And I'm now living in Germany. So I'm a proper immigrant. So there's many great questions that come out of this theme of identity, I think.
And only in the last 2 years you got shifted to Berlin, right?
Correct. Yeah. January 22, I moved here.
Yeah, you mentioned that. You were born in UK. So help me understand, how was it to come from an Indian origin, born in the UK? How was that for you?
Very confusing. And it was very conflicting in childhood because my parents were both Punjabi Indians, Sikh, and all of those identities, all those labels were very important to them. And they had left their families behind, moved to the UK, had 4 children. I'm the youngest of 4. And for various family reasons, because of actually a lot of trauma in our family, we were quite shut off from extended family. So it was just us as a unit. We didn't get too close to other families, which meant that the main place that I could be around other people was at school. So inevitably, as I started to go from sort of toddler to school to being around other kids a lot, my identity was formed around mostly white British kids. So at that age in particular, you're never conscious about what identity you're choosing or picking people based on any other reason other than you get on with them, you're having fun with them. So my emerging cultural identity became quite British. All my cultural references were British. The things I was interested in was British, sense of humor, music as I got older, films, all of it. But at the same time at home, it was very Indian. And this was very common for children of my generation, of families of my generation. There's this conflict between the culture that was expected at home and the culture that you're living outside home and the person you're becoming. Because having moved from India to the UK, my parents were very keen to retain that Indian culture, and I was becoming increasingly British. So it created this sort of conflict and this divide, this sort of dual identity.
Now help me understand. You said that there were some traumatic events that you had to go through as a child because the families were not talking to each other. There was not much of an interaction between your immediate family and the family back in the country, right? And also you said something. You said, my identity was formed by British kids. And then you spoke about the concept of the dual identity. Tell me, what was going on in the mind of Rajinder then?
Well, the older I got, the more conflicting it became because it felt, so if we look back to when I was, say, 12 or 14, it started to become more independent, starting to really form a sense of these are the things I'm interested in and following those ideas. It was this very present everyday feeling of when I'm outside home, when I'm at school, I can just express myself freely and be the person I want to be and be around all these people. And I loved school. That was one of the reasons I loved school. I could just be, or I felt like I was expressing myself fully. At home, I had to almost revert to a different person, a person that had to think about being disciplined and being quiet and more reserved and studious, and all my exuberance had to be suppressed. And also I had to leave behind a lot of the ideas that were considered sort of Western in coming back into my family home. To come to your original question, that trauma was there in my family before I was born. And there'll still be much that I don't understand because having moved countries, moved continents, my parents were born around about the time of partition. There will be all this intergenerational trauma that's playing out. But in my sort of lifetime, my dad moved to the UK first. He moved to a small industrial town in the Midlands where 2 of his brothers lived. He lived with one of his older brothers, and he was treated really, really badly. So eventually he gathered together enough money to buy himself a house. He moved out. He got himself a lodger. Someone then reported him for having a lodger, not declaring that he had rental income, which he suspects may have been his brother. So he had to sell his house, move back in with his brother. By this point, he'd married my mum, who had moved across from India. And the two of them were treated really, really badly. As you probably know, when you leave, when you get married, when you move somewhere else, you're given a chest, a bitti full of your belongings and gifts from people. And much of this was stolen from my mum when she moved into her brother-in-law and sister-in-law's house. And both of them were bullied and treated very, very badly by my uncle. So eventually my dad, this time in secret, accumulated enough money to buy a house again, but this time knowing he wouldn't need a lodger. And so on the day that he moved out, he said to my uncle, his brother, "We're finished. We're never going to speak again." And so we grew up with uncles and cousins in this small town that we would see at temple every Sunday that we didn't speak to. My dad went to work in a factory 6 days a week with his older brother, and they didn't speak. So you can imagine the toll that took on him and the toll that took on our family and how that played out in our family. Or you can imagine some of it, perhaps.
And I'm just trying to understand that now you can speak about that. What must be going on in the child who understands that here is this person who is his uncle, and yet I'm not allowed to speak to him? And there was so much going on all around. I'm just wondering, what is it that you were dealing with that you believe you could deal with it better? I should not have perceived the situation through those lenses. Anything that you can recall?
Well, as a child, I guess I reduced things to a simple narrative. You know, that person bad, this person good. So my dad good, these people bad. The truth of it, I will never know. But what I did quite unconsciously take up, I think, is the idea that families can split in that way, and that you can cut people out, and that you can push people away, and not recognize that that will have some lasting effect. So that pattern was established for me at a very young age of how siblings might treat each other, for example. And that's something I explored with my therapist a few years ago, about how those patterns can persist, not just in sibling relationships, but all relationships. Knowing what I know now, I'd perhaps go back and try and help that child understand some more of what might be going on and some of the nuance of what's going on.
Yeah. And Jindy, you know what? It did not stop there for you. The life was not that easy for you. You lost your father very early in your life. And you mentioned that the loss of your father at that young age and the lack of male role models seem to have played a pivotal role in helping you become who you have become, or has a huge impact on the way you showed up as an individual. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so my dad died quite suddenly when I was 13, and my sister was the eldest, 18. My brothers were 17 and 16. So we were all teenagers. And 13 is no ideal age to lose a parent, particularly in childhood. I was just entering my teenage years and just starting to develop into or form the foundations of the adult I was going to become. And I lost the only elder male role model I had in my life. I had two older brothers, but they were both teenagers, both also figuring things out. So what kind of unfolded, I guess, over the next maybe 15, 16 years was a lot of seeking and making mistakes and dealing with a lot of unresolved stuff, particularly becoming a young man and feeling that I had to figure this out on my own, and having no model to follow, no mentor, no person to speak to try and figure this out. And that absence, I didn't really realize until much older, until I was maybe in my early to mid 30s, that this had been a real setback for me. And I still explore what losing him meant. You know, I recently became a father 3 months ago. And that, thank you. And that, of course, has brought forward ideas of fatherhood, memories of my father, wishing he was here for certain moments. So there's still lots of phases of the way this plays out in losing my dad the way I did. So to come back to your question, there was I was coming of age at a time when I didn't have a male role model, and that was in the 90s in the UK, which was not a healthy good time for masculine role models.
What were those assumptions that you were born with, especially after the age of 13? Those assumptions around what it means to be a male, what it means to have that masculine energy you picked up then.
So I guess I grew up in a dual patriarchal culture. It's the way I describe it, British and Indian, both patriarchal cultures. The ideas that I had taken on board about being a man and being masculine were things like winning, competing, domineering, always striving, doing things alone, particularly me because of the losing my dad in the way that I did, and not sharing or kind of shutting down certain parts of myself in order to be as masculine and male as possible. That was, at least that was the attempt.
Let me just take a pause here, because I know what you just shared right now is pure gold. There are so many Indians right now who will be listening to you, and they would be able to experience those traits and those traces of these reactive patterns in themselves. And you use the word winning, dominating, domineering, striving, and doing things alone, not sharing. I'm just wondering, these are the assumptions with which you were growing and stepping into what it means to be a man, leaving behind all the other childhood traits that we all are blessed with. Then what happened? Fast forward in your life. What was that moment when you decided to let go of the 2 degrees that you could pick up for yourself and switch into the kind of work that you are doing today? You do a lot of work, especially with male population, right? Why did you choose to work with this specific target audience? What was that transitioning moment in your life?
Well, I can tell you when it started, and I can tell you roughly when it finished. It started when I was 30. I was working in a big consulting firm and doing well. I was good at what I did. My life looked glamorous from the outside. I was traveled internationally. I was in a hotel room in Copenhagen, doing a piece of work in Denmark, and I realized I was miserable. I really didn't enjoy what I was doing, and I felt lost again. Having entered this consulting world that felt really exciting and indulged my curiosity and intellectual, I realized this wasn't it. This wasn't what I wanted to do, but I didn't know what I did want to do. So I ended up working with a coach, a really amazing coach who I'm still in touch with. And we worked together regularly for, I think, maybe 2.5 years. And what I didn't realize at the time was I entered into that relationship with the idea of, I'm lost in my career, help me out with my career. But of course, as we know, as coaches, you're never just working with that, you're working with much more. And she had a corporate background, but also had a strong spiritual aspect to her practice, to her coaching practice. And I remember saying to her when we started working together, I like the fact that you've got this corporate background. I'm not interested in this spiritual nonsense. But clearly I was, because I chose her. I spoke to several coaches and there was something about her. And what she started to uncover, or help me to uncover and allow to re-emerge, was some of the things we've described: creativity, play, the more feminine side, the more soulful side. And that journey, what happened over the next sort of 10, 12 years was all sorts of things that I tried, different directions I took my career in, bold steps that I took. I became an independent consultant about 8 or 9 years ago, started my coaching practice about 3 years ago. So, I mean, you were describing that arc with your hand, and it has been an arc, and it's an arc that continues, but it started back then. And there's been points along the way, and one that springs to mind is maybe 3.5 years ago, I was in a meditation retreat at the end of the year, which I used to go to in London. And in the middle of that retreat came this idea, this vivid thought rather, in my head, that this sort of work, coaching work, working with people, working with leaders, working with men, this is what is next for my life. And it was such a big thought for me that I held on to it for a couple of weeks before I spoke to anyone about it.
When you emphasized on the fact that there I was sitting doing my work while working in a consulting company, in one of those evenings, I was in that room and I was being lost. Help me understand, how did you know that what you were experiencing in that moment was a sense of loss for you? How do you know that's a sense of being lost?
Feeling lost in that moment was this sense of I'd become quite a self-sufficient person, both I think because of the ideas of masculinity I'd taken on, but also because of my losing my dad and all of that background. So I had a pretty good way of figuring things out on my own. But in that moment, I couldn't see any way forward. I couldn't see any options. I mean, there were plenty of options, but I couldn't see any that felt like they meant something to me. So going round and round in those circles, which I realized I've been going round in for a while, left me feeling like I don't know what I'm doing here. And I've got no tool, I've got no manual for this, I've got no toolkit, all the usual things aren't working, all my usual problem solving, and I was very head-led and very rational at that time, is leading me nowhere. And that was creating a great deal of anxiety and stress in me. And that was the feeling for me of being lost. And in that moment, actually, I called my closest friend in the organization. And I remember sitting in that hotel room, and I called him and I told him how I was feeling. And I remember he said back to me, "I've never heard you like this before." And that stayed with me. I was like, okay, this is something that I'm going through here. This is something different.
I'm just trying to connect dots because I'm sure there are so many of us who go through different kinds of feelings. And just because we cannot name them, and thus we can't tame them. But I'm listening right now, Jindy, you were self sufficient, everything was there all around you, and yet you could not find out which direction you should be going. And in my mind, there are instances in my life when I have found myself clueless in terms of what's the next direction I should be taking, where I find it very difficult to find meaning in the work that I'm doing. That's a difficult space to be in.
Confusion, isolation, figuring this out on your own. We see again and again in our work with men this sense of we must figure this out on our own. We must do these things on our own. And in every group we've ever run, at least one person will say, "It's great to know I'm not alone," when they've heard the stories of other men.
And interestingly, that too specifically, when here is this man who picked up very early in his life terms like winning, dominating, steering, striving, doing itself, not sharing, being in isolation. That's what you picked up very early in your life. And when you are operating from that space, what is not available to you is something which is significant for you, which is a sense of connection, a sense of being playful, cheerful, creative. And that's where one is dominating over the core of who you were as an individual.
Exactly that.
How did you get out of that space? One is you mentioned that you had a coach who worked with you for 2.5 years. What is it that you had to question and challenge within yourself? And how was the journey?
The journey itself was multifaceted. If you told me then I was embarking on a 12-year journey, I might not have started. And it's a journey that continues, by the way, but that kind of chapter, I guess, was that long. And I think the biggest thread through all of it was reconnecting me to my intuition and trusting myself to follow it. So not long after I started working with my coach, I moved to this smaller consulting firm, very small, 23 people, and they were growing, and we trebled in size over 3 years. And I was part of that journey, and I really enjoyed it. At the same time, I was exploring other parts of myself. So I did a novel writing course because I've always been passionate about writing. So I did this novel writing course and other courses. And then we got towards the end of this 3 years, and it started to feel quite corporate and constrictive again. And I had this sudden call to adventure. And again, I was paying attention to my intuition. And this call to adventure manifested as I want to cycle down the west coast of the US. And I have no idea where that idea came from. I didn't even own a bike at the time. So I asked my firm for a sabbatical. They didn't have a sabbatical policy. They agreed to give me 3 months off. And I bought a bike, and 2 months later, I cycled down the west coast of the US, which was an incredible experience. Just all sorts of memories and moments in that trip, and a feeling of being truly disconnected from that world and being connected to the real world, the natural world. And with that much time and space, inevitably that was going to change me as a person. And I came back, and I remember my first day back on a client site in Canary Wharf in London in an investment bank. The moment I walked through those doors, I knew I couldn't do this anymore. And so I quit, and I had nothing else lined up to go to. I didn't have that much money in the bank, but I knew, I just had this visceral embodied sense of I can't do this work anymore. And I look back on that decision now and I think, wow, that was pretty ballsy. I don't know how I did that, but something bigger was saying you can't do this anymore. And then many things since then: meditation, spiritual practice, medicine journeys, psychedelic journeys, working with a therapist, working with a psychoanalyst, lots and lots of development work that continues, that will always continue. But it's all been part of that journey of unfolding and returning to that essence.
Help me understand the question that I asked you. What are those traditional notions of being a man that has shaken your core as an individual? Let me just revisit this one question. What are those traditional notions of being a man that you had to challenge during this developmental journey that you're talking about?
Intimacy, being intimate with everyone, and especially men, and being able to cultivate intimacy in my male friendships and male relationships. This is something, if I can refer to theory for a second, this is something James Hollis, the Jungian, talks about. He talks about the 3 unconscious promises that a boy makes in the process of becoming a man. The first is he must reject intimacy and intimate friendships because that's considered, sort of feminine and doesn't fit the modern idea of being masculine. He must disconnect from his own intuition, so his own embodied wisdom and sense of intuition. And thirdly, he must start to live by these external rules of what it means to be a man. And these rules are never clearly defined, nor is it known who owns them, so you can never challenge them. So you start to do some of the things that I described about success and competing and dominating. And I see those 3 things over and over again. That kind of transition from boy to man, that disconnection from intimacy and intuition and living by these external rules. And that's definitely was my journey and is part of what I'm exactly.
Letting go of intimacy, letting go of intuition, and living by the external norms. I'm just wondering in my life, when was the time when I sat with my friends to share my vulnerabilities? When did I start that? It started only a few years back when I started to explore myself, when I started to dig deeper into my intuition, when I started to question and challenge that that's not who I would like to be and how I would like to live.
And what happened when you did that? What did you experience?
I told you a few years back when I was traveling and I was talking on this called Traveling Light in Your Life. I think I've started to take myself less seriously. And it allows me to be vulnerable. It's okay to cry. It's okay to go back to people and say, I don't know, I've screwed it up. I don't need to carry that load of, I personally find the term leader as super loaded. I mean, the moment you call somebody you are a leader, suddenly something shifts in this person. Really? For what? Just because you're a leader does not mean that you don't need to be a human being. You don't need to express your intimacy with people. You don't need to operate from your intuition. And you have to live by the external norms. So I think those things started to shift in me, Jindy. Now, help me understand. Let's look at a man through the lens of a female. What's the role of females in this entire context, because of which men start to show up or behave in this strange manner that they have to live by the external norms? They cannot talk about those softer side of what it means to be a man.
What I've observed and experienced are cultures that are masculine dominated, So we could start with society in general, politics, organizations, down to relationships. And if we just look at organizations for a second, because that's where most of my work has been, many organizations, particularly larger profit-driven ones, have masculine cultures inherently. And so from a leadership perspective, often what I've witnessed is when there are female leaders that emerge, they are adopting masculine ideas or a masculine model of leadership, which comes back to some of those things we talked about: aggression, dominance, competing, which again have a healthy side and a shadow side. And what that has led to, again, thinking from an organizational perspective, but it could apply to any of those contexts, are cultures of disconnection, where people are sort of deprioritized and human connection is deprioritized in service of some bigger idea, of some idea of success or progress or growth. So if we look at that from, and I'm speaking from a UK or European perspective here, all of the health indicators, not just for men, but for women, are heading in the wrong direction. 3 out of all 4 suicides in the UK are men. That's been the case for a couple of decades now. It's the same in Germany, it's the same in the US. I think it's slightly higher in the US, in fact. Men are 3 times more likely to abuse alcohol or drugs, 3 times more likely to get addicted, significantly less likely to refer themselves for talking therapy. So when they do recognize they might be struggling with something, they're far less likely to go and get help for it. Women, meanwhile, have a number of other similar indicators that are heading in the wrong direction. And so we've created these cultures that aren't healthy for people. And for me, one aspect of that is that they're dominated by this particular idea of masculinity. And this is just one dominant idea of masculinity. It's not masculinity overall.
I'm just listening to you. A new Pandora box is opening up for me. I'm saying that what we're discussing right now, it's not at all a small challenge to handle. Because if that's how the entire male population has been painted, one, it's too much of a stress for a man to show up in a particular way in a particular society. That's one. And then the contextual expectation that continues to put pressure onto him. In your work, how do you start to unfold this? And what are the challenges that a man goes through before he realizes that, shucks, man, it's a disaster towards which I am marching towards?
So I guess in the challenge is also the opportunity in doing this work. So you described this pressure, and also I think you used the word weight or burden. And these are very much the sorts of words or themes that come up in working with men. They'll talk about this sense of, I've got to do it. I've got to carry this weight, this load.
Yeah.
For example, breadwinner is a word that's often used, this idea that I must be the breadwinner in the family and I must take that responsibility and stress. When they start to realize that they're taking up that role, or name that they're taking up that role, and also see what it's doing to them, and also see that by recognizing that they can start to let go of that idea, then they also start to see that I don't need to be this role. I don't need to take up this role. I can share. I can talk about how I'm feeling. I can share some of the burden. I can let go of some of these ideas about this role. And that's not easy because, as you said, gender is an identity. It's one of the first identities we take up in childhood. But the first step to that is awareness, is bringing it into awareness of, this is the idea I've got about being a man, and actually it doesn't make much sense, and I've never really interrogated that or challenged it.
Yeah, and I'm sure that's very painful, because that's so embedded into your identity that to take it out of your life means taking your life away.
It's where the conversation is at right now around masculinity and men. I think there is this call that men want to change, but also should change, but also then change to what? We're in this kind of in-between space. And that's where the conversation is at the moment, of navigating what this means. You know, we've had sort of 50 years of feminism that's made a lot of progress, and hopefully will continue to make progress. Men are now kind of undergoing that journey themselves. What does this all mean? What does man mean? What is the role of man? What is masculinity?
Yeah.
And it's an uncomfortable journey.
It is, because, the moment you ask somebody, who are you? The person begins with, my name is so and so. I'm working as a vice president with so and so organization. And on your passport, it says male. And if you put all these identities together, if you ask this person, what does it mean to be a man? The person would begin, as you spoke about, the bread earner of the family, and what it means to be a human being. That's where we start to fumble.
Yeah.
In your life, you said that you have a son, 3 months, right? I'm just wondering, the way you show up as a father with him, how it would have been different if you were blessed with a baby girl.
That's an interesting question. My wife and I, we had a lot of conversations about how we want to be as parents. And where we kept coming back to was, certainly where I landed was, what's my primary role as a parent? And where I landed was, it's to try to witness or recognize the soul that is present with me in this human being, and allow it to emerge in its fullest, and kind of get out of the way. And one of the key things for me is, and this comes from very much from my own experience, is to give an emotional education to my son. And I think it would have been no different.
Yeah. It would not have been different, because you know what, Jindy, I'm actually questioning when you said that would not have been different. I'm actually questioning and challenging this for myself as well, because I have a baby girl. And when I asked this question, I asked that question for myself as well. The way I treat my daughter, is it the same way that I treated my nephews in the past? And my answer is no. My answer is no, because the moment she takes bath and the moment she is out of the bathroom, I ask my wife, hey, just quickly dress her up, which was not the case when my nephew was born. And there's very, very small things. And I'm just questioning and challenging myself, because unless I start to treat her like a human being, somebody else is going to define her as her, because somebody treated me like a boy. And I think that's where, if you look at what's happening in the society, there are a lot of things that we can actually question: what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, everything. If I look at everything all around me as I'm just listening to you, I'm actually questioning my own very existence of what it means to be a human being.
You touched on something really important, and that's got me reflecting. What I described perhaps was my intention as a parent. What my actual reality will also include lots that's unconscious in me about a boy and what a boy should do. And I think my role is to try and pay attention to that as much as possible. But unavoidably, I will gender my son in some way.
We will, because that's the blind spots that we all are born into, Jindy. Now, the very fact that we can actually be the torch holders, the torch bearers of this space, I think if not today, in the next 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, if together we start to work on this space, we'll be able to create a small dent in the universe, as Steve Jobs would say it. In all these years, Jindy, what was that one notion that you had about yourself as being a man that you found extremely difficult to let go of and release yourself of that pain and the burden of being a man?
The hardest thing, I think, is something I'm probably still working on, and that's being the one who figures things out, being that self-sufficient streak of figuring it out on my own.
And what's on the other side of when you release this?
Well, interestingly, in my own work, and particularly through a leadership lens, is there's the opportunity for a form of leadership that's much more collective and community led, almost, of not needing to be the one who has the answer, of returning to intimacy in relationships.
Thank you. And Going back to your past as a child once again, what is that worst piece of advice that you received as a child that you would not want to give to anyone, and especially as a boy child?
Don't talk about your feelings.
Thank you so much, Jindy, for sharing what all you have shared. And I did want to talk about the book called The Selfish Leader. However, this is the positive time. We'll have to bring you back. I'm sure our audience is going to love this interaction. Thank you so much. And now, wherever you are in your life, Jindy, what do you know for sure with 100% certainty?
The journey never ends.
The journey never ends. It's a journey. Thank you for being such a beautiful guest. So it doesn't really matter who we are, for as long as we can continue to walk on this path of what it means to be a human. And it's a journey that never ends. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on. Thank you for this beautiful conversation and your very thoughtful questions.